A crown rests heavy on a velvet cushion, its gold dulled by time, its jewels darkened like dried blood. This is the crown of Henry VIII, a king remembered not only for his power, but for the women who vanished beneath its weight. 6 marriages, 6 queens, love sworn before God, then shattered by fear, obsession, and the blade. In the echoing halls of Tudor England, marriage was not romance, it was survival. To fail a king was to gamble with your life. To bear only daughters was to invite suspicion, and to fall out of favor was to step closer to the Tower of London, where stone walls whispered prayers and final confessions. Henry VIII did not begin as a monster. He was young, brilliant, admired across Europe. Yet as years passed, desire hardened into control, faith twisted into justification, and love became a tool of power. One by one, his wives were elevated to queens and then discarded as obstacles. Divorced, beheaded, died. Divorced, beheaded, survived. These words echo through history like a grim nursery rhyme, but behind them were real women, ambitious, devout, clever, trapped. This is not merely the story of a king and his marriages. It is a story of how absolute power corrupts the heart, and how love, once promised, can become a death sentence. England, at the dawn of the 16th century, was a nation still haunted by bloodshed. For decades, the Wars of the Roses had torn the kingdom apart, brother against brother, noble against noble, until the land itself seemed exhausted by conflict. Out of this chaos rose the Tudor dynasty, born not from ancient certainty, but from victory on a battlefield. When Henry VIII claimed the throne in 1485, he did not inherit a secure kingdom. He seized a fragile one. The Tudors ruled by caution and calculation. Henry VIII knew that crowns won by war could be lost just as easily. He strengthened his grip through alliances, marriages, and relentless control of the nobility. Every decision was shaped by fear of rebellion, every heir a safeguard against collapse. Stability became the dynasty's obsession. At the heart of this new royal house was a single, terrifying truth. Without a male heir, everything could unravel. The memory of civil war lingered like a curse, whispering that succession disputes led only to blood. A strong king needed a son. A dynasty needed continuity. Without it, England could fall back into chaos. This pressure would shape the life of Henry VIII long before he ever wore the crown. He was born into a family where marriage was not love, but strategy, where queens were valued for wombs as much as loyalty. The Tudor throne demanded heirs, obedience, and absolute control, no matter the cost. The dynasty presented itself as glorious and divinely favored, yet beneath the pageantry lay anxiety and paranoia. Every court celebration masked insecurity. Every christening carried desperate hope. It was within this atmosphere of fear disguised as power that Henry VIII was raised. The Tudor dynasty did not merely rule England, it reshaped it through force, faith, and family. And as history would soon reveal, the survival of this house would be written not only in laws and battles, but in the lives, marriages, and deaths of 6 queens. On a cold summer night in 1491, within the stone walls of Greenwich Palace, a prince was born into uncertainty, disguised as triumph. Henry Tudor, the second son of King Henry VII and Elizabeth of York, entered a world where survival mattered more than destiny. Church bells rang, prayers were offered, and England celebrated, but few believed this child would ever wear the crown. Henry was not raised to rule. That burden belonged to his elder brother, Arthur, Prince of Wales, carefully groomed to inherit the fragile Tudor throne. Young Henry lived in Arthur's shadow, spared the crushing weight of expectation. Instead, he was allowed to flourish. He grew strong, athletic, and curious, trained in music, theology, languages, and the art of chivalry. Tutors praised his sharp mind and charm. Courtiers admired his golden hair and confidence. He was everything a Renaissance prince should be, without the fear that came with kingship. Yet danger always lingered. The Tudor dynasty was still new, still vulnerable. Pretenders claimed royal blood. Plots simmered in whispers. Even as a child, Henry learned that power was never secure, and loyalty could vanish overnight. His father ruled with caution and suspicion, teaching by example that mercy was weakness and control was survival. As Henry matured, he watched his brother's marriage to Catherine of Aragon, a union meant to bind England to Spain and protect the throne. It was a reminder that royal marriages were contracts, not love stories. Queens were chosen for alliances and heirs, not affection. Then, fate intervened. In 1502, Prince Arthur died suddenly, leaving England stunned and the Tudor succession exposed. Almost overnight, the spare became the heir. Henry's carefree youth ended. The crown, once distant, now loomed before him like a shadow stretching across his life. The boy who was free was gone. In his place stood a prince whose future and marriages would decide the fate of England itself. The death of Prince Arthur shattered more than a family. It exposed the fragile heart of the Tudor dynasty. England had placed its hopes in the eldest son, the carefully chosen heir who would secure the throne and prevent the kingdom from sliding back into civil war. With Arthur gone, the future of England rested on a boy who had never been meant to rule. Henry was barely 11 years old when the weight of succession fell upon him. Overnight, his life was transformed. The freedoms of a second son vanished, replaced with watchful eyes and rigid expectations. Every lesson, every prayer, every public appearance now carried new meaning. He was no longer merely a prince, he was the future king of England. King Henry VII responded with urgency and fear. The dynasty could not afford weakness. Alliances had to be preserved, and the most important of these was the marriage treaty with Spain. Catherine of Aragon, Arthur's young widow, remained in England, her fate uncertain. To break the alliance would invite political danger. To preserve it required an unthinkable solution. Catherine would marry the younger brother of her dead husband. The church debated, diplomats argued, and theologians searched scripture for justification. Was it lawful for a man to marry his brother's widow? A papal dispensation was granted, and the marriage plan moved forward, quietly, carefully, while Henry was still a child. Even then, the seeds of future conflict were being planted. As Henry grew into adolescence, the crown hovered closer. He learned to mask emotion with ceremony, to hide doubt behind confidence. Beneath the polished image of the prince, insecurity took root. He had not been trained for this role, yet failure was unthinkable. When his father died in 1509, the crown passed without protest. At 17, Henry VIII ascended the throne, not through ambition, but through circumstance. The unexpected crown now rested upon his head, and with it came expectations that would shape his reign, his marriages, and his descent into obsession and tyranny. In the winter of 1501, a young princess crossed the narrow sea between Spain and England. carrying with her the weight of two powerful kingdoms. Catherine of Aragon was only 15, yet she had been prepared her entire life for this moment. Daughter of Ferdinand of Aragon and Isabella of Castile, the monarchs who united Spain and funded Columbus, she was born into faith, discipline, and imperial ambition. When Catherine first set foot on English soil, she was greeted with ceremony and expectation. To England, she was more than a bride. She was an alliance made flesh, a living promise of security against France and rivals abroad. Trained from childhood to be a queen, Catherine spoke Latin fluently, studied theology, and possessed a deep, unshakable devotion to God. She believed her destiny was guided by divine will. Her marriage to Prince Arthur, heir to the Tudor throne, was celebrated with lavish pageantry. The court rejoiced, convinced the future of England was secure. Yet behind the celebration lingered uncertainty. Arthur was frail, and the English court watched closely, measuring hope against fear. Only months later, that fear became reality. Arthur fell ill and died, leaving Catherine a widow in a foreign land before her 16th birthday. Overnight, her status collapsed. She was no longer the future queen, but a political problem. England debated her value. Spain demanded her dowry. Catherine herself was left in limbo, isolated, grieving, and uncertain whether her marriage had even been consummated. Despite hardship, Catherine endured. She lived quietly, clinging to faith and dignity, refusing to return to Spain in disgrace. She believed God had not abandoned her. When young Prince Henry became heir to the throne, Catherine's fate shifted once more. Slowly, carefully, negotiations resumed. Later years, when Henry VIII ascended the throne, Catherine's long wait ended. She became Queen of England at last, crowned beside a young king who admired her intelligence and virtue. To Catherine, this was not merely a crown, it was the fulfillment of destiny. Yet beneath the triumph lay a fragile truth. Her position depended on one thing alone, producing a male heir, and time already was beginning to turn against her. In 1509, England celebrated not just a coronation, but a union meant to secure the future of the realm. Henry VIII, only 17 years old, married Catherine of Aragon just weeks after ascending the throne. To the public, it appeared a romantic beginning, a handsome young king taking as his bride a virtuous and dignified queen. But beneath the splendor of tournaments and church bells, this marriage was an act of calculated politics. For Henry, the match solved immediate problems. Catherine brought legitimacy, prestige, and continuity. She had been married to his brother, yes, but she also carried the authority of Spain, Europe's most powerful Catholic kingdom. By marrying her, Henry strengthened England's position on the international stage and reassured a nation still fearful of dynastic collapse. The alliance signaled stability, tradition, and divine approval. At first, affection seemed genuine. Henry admired Catherine's intelligence, piety, and composure. She was older, wiser, and deeply committed to her role as queen. She offered counsel, supported Henry's ambitions, and represented England with dignity abroad. Together, they embodied the ideal Christian monarchy, young, devout, and confident in God's favor. The early years of their marriage were marked with optimism. Court life flourished with music, poetry, and extravagant pageantry. Henry styled himself a Renaissance prince, a warrior king in the making. Catherine stood proudly beside him, even serving as regent while he campaigned in France. For a time, theirs appeared a true partnership. Yet this was never simply a love match. From the beginning,
The marriage carried an unspoken condition. Catherine must give Henry a son. Without a male heir, all alliances were meaningless. Every pregnancy was watched by the court, every miscarriage whispered about in corridors. As years passed and sons failed to survive, pressure replaced affection. What began as a promising union slowly hardened into expectation and then resentment. The political marriage that had once secured Henry's throne would one day become, in his eyes, its greatest threat. For a brief, shining moment, Henry VIII's reign seemed touched by destiny itself. These were the golden years, a time when England believed it had found not only stability, but glory. The young king was tall, handsome, and full of energy, dazzling both his court and foreign ambassadors. He rode horses with effortless skill, hunted tirelessly, and dominated tournaments clad in glittering armor. To many, Henry appeared the very image of a perfect Renaissance monarch. Court life flourished under his rule. Music filled the halls of palaces. Poetry was recited beside roaring fires, and lavish feasts displayed England's growing wealth. Henry himself composed songs and played instruments, surrounding himself with scholars, artists, and theologians. Catherine of Aragon presided as queen with calm authority, admired for her dignity and intelligence. Together, they projected an image of harmony and divine favor. England stood confident on the European stage. Henry pursued military glory in France, eager to prove himself a warrior like the kings of old. While he was abroad, Catherine ruled as regent, even overseeing the defense of the realm against Scotland. Her victory at Flodden, where the Scottish king was killed, brought her praise and strengthened her reputation as a capable queen. In these years, hope overshadowed fear. The Tudor dynasty felt secure. Each pregnancy was celebrated as a promise of the future. Bells rang, prayers were offered, and the court waited anxiously for the cry of a healthy prince. But beneath the splendor, cracks were forming. Pregnancies ended in loss. Sons were born, then buried. Each tragedy was quietly absorbed, masked by ceremony and optimism. Publicly, Henry and Catherine smiled. Privately, expectation grew heavier with each passing year. The golden years glimmered brightly, but they were fragile. What appeared to be a perfect reign rested on a single unanswered question: who would inherit the crown? And as time slipped forward, that question would darken everything that followed. As the years passed, celebration gave way to silence. The Tudor court, once filled with hope and confidence, grew tense with whispered anxiety. At the center of it all stood a single, devastating reality. England still had no male heir. For a dynasty born from civil war, this was not a private disappointment. It was a looming national crisis. Catherine of Aragon endured pregnancy after pregnancy under the watchful eyes of courtiers and physicians. Each time, England held its breath. Each time, hope collapsed into mourning. Sons were stillborn or died within weeks. Daughters lived, but daughters could not silence the fear of another succession struggle. Only one child survived infancy, Princess Mary, and her existence, rather than securing the throne, only deepened the problem. Henry's frustration grew with each loss. What had once been shared grief slowly became blame. The king began to see his marriage not as a blessing, but as a curse. He searched for meaning in Scripture, fixating on a verse from Leviticus that warned a man who married his brother's widow would remain childless. To Henry, this was no coincidence. It was divine judgment. The court felt the shift. Catherine, once admired, now stood isolated. She remained dignified and defiant, insisting her marriage to Arthur had never been consummated and that her union with Henry was lawful in God's eyes. Her faith was unshakable, but faith could not change the king's growing obsession. England needed certainty, and Henry needed a son to secure his legacy. The fear of chaos haunted him, the same chaos that had destroyed generations before the Tudors. In his mind, the solution was no longer patience, prayer, or endurance. The heir problem transformed Henry VIII. Love hardened into resentment. Devotion turned into justification. And in his desperate search for a male successor, the king began down a path that would shatter his marriage, defy the church, and alter the course of English history forever. As the years of marriage passed, Henry VIII's admiration for Catherine of Aragon began to twist into fear. Fear not of her, but of the consequences of their childless union. The king, once confident and vibrant, became obsessed with the idea that God himself was punishing him. He pored over scripture, searching for guidance, and found in Leviticus a warning that a man who married his brother's widow would remain childless. To Henry, this was no distant admonition, it was a direct judgment against him, and he could not ignore it. Every miscarriage, every stillbirth, every daughter born into a world that demanded a male heir deepened his anxiety. The king began to see the court differently. Allies were measured not only by loyalty, but by their capacity to advise or justify his desires. His counselors whispered, and their whispers only intensified his paranoia. Was Catherine to blame? Could the queen, once loved and admired, be the obstacle between him and divine favor? These questions haunted him day and night. Henry's fear extended beyond personal disappointment. England's stability rested on the promise of a male heir. Without a son, the Tudor dynasty could unravel. Rebellion, civil unrest, and foreign interference loomed like shadows on the horizon. The weight of centuries of bloodshed pressed upon him. Every decision, every alliance, every marriage plan in the future would be measured against this one pressing need, securing the throne for his lineage. This fear would come to dominate Henry's mind and actions. Love, once real and genuine, became conditional. Marriage was no longer a sacred union, but a calculated necessity. Catherine's loyalty, piety, and devotion mattered less than the presence or absence of a son. And in that fear, Henry VIII began to forge the path that would lead him to defy the church, cast aside his queen, and plunge England into religious and political upheaval. Amid the gilded halls of Henry VIII's court, a new presence arrived, one that would forever alter the fate of England. Anne Boleyn, a young Englishwoman of sharp wit and striking intelligence, returned from her education in the Netherlands and France, bringing with her the elegance of continental courts and a defiance that set her apart from other ladies of the court. She was not merely beautiful, she was magnetic, enigmatic, and unafraid to challenge the conventions of her time. From the moment she appeared, courtiers whispered. Anne's eyes were said to hold both ambition and mischief. She spoke in clever turns of phrase, displaying a mind that could match any scholar or advisor in Henry's court. Unlike other women who offered submission and obedience, Anne presented curiosity and confidence. She laughed freely, walked with purpose, and refused to bow entirely to the king's whims. Henry VIII, already restless in his marriage to Catherine of Aragon, took notice. At first, it was amusement, then fascination. Anne was different from any woman he had known. She teased, provoked, and demanded attention without outright defiance. She refused to be a mere accessory, a pawn in dynastic games. To Henry, this was irresistible. The court, a place of intrigue and hidden agendas, sensed the storm brewing. Allies aligned, enemies plotted, and whispers of romance began to circulate. But Anne's presence was more than a flirtation. It was a challenge to the established order. She would force Henry to confront not only his desires, but the rigidity of church law, the sanctity of his marriage, and the political consequences of pursuing a woman who refused to yield. With Anne Boleyn at court, England stood on the brink of scandal, revolution, and transformation. A queen in waiting had arrived, not quietly, not obediently, but boldly, and her ambition would ignite a chain of events that no one, not even the king, could fully control.
Anne Boleyn's allure was not simply her beauty, it was her audacity. Unlike the submissive women of Henry VIII's court, she refused to become his mistress. She knew her value, and she would not surrender it lightly. The king, accustomed to obedience and flattery, was both intrigued and frustrated. Here was a woman who dared to resist him, and that very resistance made her irresistible. Court gossip spread like wildfire. Anne's sharp tongue and clever remarks hinted at a mind as captivating as her presence. She engaged with Henry not with passive submission, but with teasing intellect and subtle defiance. Every encounter became a delicate game of power and desire. Henry, who had always wielded authority effortlessly, found himself challenged. For the first time, he could not simply command devotion, he had to earn it or force it. Anne's refusal was strategic and deliberate. She knew that a mere dalliance would never secure her place in history. To become queen, she needed more than Henry's attention. She needed his commitment. And so she played the court like a chessboard, advancing carefully, testing loyalties, and ensuring that her position was never assumed, never guaranteed. This defiance ignited a dangerous obsession in Henry. He pursued her relentlessly, desperate to possess what she would not freely give. Meanwhile, Catherine of Aragon remained queen, a figure of piety and stability, and the church still forbade divorce. Every step Anne took, every refusal, every clever reply, forced Henry into choices that would challenge the authority of the papacy, the morality of the court, and the very foundation of England's religious life. Anne Boleyn was no passive pawn. She was a woman who wielded intelligence, charm, and defiance as her weapons. By refusing a king, she did more than resist desire. She reshaped the destiny of a nation, setting England on a path toward revolution, reformation, and scandal. In her defiance lay the spark that would ignite the Tudor dynasty's most dramatic chapter. Henry VIII's desire to marry Anne Boleyn was no mere romantic fancy. It became a national crisis known as the Great Matter. The king, once confident in his authority, now faced the rigid power of the church. His marriage to Catherine of Aragon, lawful and sacred in the eyes of Rome, stood as a barrier to his ambitions. Yet Henry was determined to secure both personal desire and the future of his dynasty. He needed a male heir, and he believed only Anne could provide it. The Great Matter was more than divorce. It was a confrontation with centuries of religious authority. Henry petitioned Pope Clement VII for an annulment, arguing that his marriage to Catherine was cursed by God because she had been his brother's wife. Scholars and theologians debated the matter endlessly, poring over scripture and canon law. The Pope, however, delayed and denied, constrained by politics, pressure from Spain, and fear of angering the powerful Holy Roman Emperor. England was trapped in uncertainty,
caught between the king's desire and the pope's refusal. Henry's frustration grew. His court buzzed with gossip, alliances shifted, and tension thickened. Supporters of Anne maneuvered carefully, while loyalists to Catherine argued for tradition and legality. The king's obsession transformed into obsessional force. He refused compromise, viewing the Pope's inaction as a personal insult and a threat to England's stability. The great matter would ultimately change the course of history. Henry began to consider radical solutions, including severing England from papal authority entirely. The consequences were enormous. The future of the monarchy, the legitimacy of heirs, and the faith of millions hung in the balance. This was not merely a king seeking a new bride. It was a king challenging the church, bending law, and reshaping the nation's identity. The great matter was the spark that ignited the English Reformation, and it began with Henry VIII's relentless pursuit of love, power, and an heir. As Henry VIII's request for an annulment reached Rome, the papal court deliberated with caution and political calculation. Pope Clement VII, bound by alliances and fearful of upsetting powerful rulers, hesitated. Granting the annulment would offend Spain, Catherine of Aragon's homeland, and provoke Charles V, the Holy Roman Emperor, who counted Catherine as his aunt. To deny the King of England risked a diplomatic rupture, but to grant it risked angering Europe's mightiest empire. The delay infuriated Henry. The young king, accustomed to obedience and loyalty, could not accept refusal or procrastination. He saw the Pope's hesitation not as prudence, but as obstruction. His obsession with Anne Boleyn intensified, and his frustration grew into resentment. The woman he desired seemed increasingly within reach, yet blocked by distant authority thousands of miles away. Within England, court whispers carried the growing tension. Scholars and clerics debated the morality of the annulment, while politicians weighed the risks of defying Rome. Catherine of Aragon, dignified and steadfast, relied on her status as a faithful Catholic and the Pope's support to defend her position. She remained unyielding, maintaining her rightful claim to the crown and her marriage. Henry's impatience and ambition soon began to overshadow tradition. He questioned the Pope's authority, pondering whether England itself could claim sovereignty in spiritual as well as political matters. The refusal or delay of Rome planted the seeds of revolution within his mind. He was no longer simply a king seeking a marital solution. He was a monarch contemplating defiance against the church itself. When Rome said no, Henry saw a personal affront, a barrier to his legacy and lineage. What began as a request for an annulment evolved into a challenge that would shake the foundation of Christendom, ignite the English Reformation, and forever alter the relationship between the crown and the church. In that moment, the stage was set for a king to place himself above God's earthly representative and reshape the course of history. When Rome refused to grant Henry VIII an annulment, the king made a choice that would change England forever. What began as a personal quest for a male heir and a desire to marry Anne Boleyn evolved into a revolutionary break from centuries of religious tradition, the English Reformation. Henry's ambition was clear. If the Pope would not bend, then England itself would. The Reformation was not born of piety, but of power. Henry declared himself supreme head of the Church of England, severing centuries of allegiance to Rome. Monasteries, previously untouchable centers of faith and wealth, came under the crown's control. Religious authority shifted from distant popes to the king himself, and the consequences rippled across every level of society. Bishops and priests were forced to swear loyalty to Henry rather than to the Vatican. To resist was to risk treason, imprisonment, or death. For Catherine of Aragon, the Reformation was a personal tragedy. Her marriage, lawful and sanctified in the eyes of Rome, was now nullified by Henry's authority. She was cast aside, stripped of her title, and sent into exile, dignified yet powerless. Meanwhile, Anne Boleyn rose, her position legitimized not by papal blessing, but by the king's will and the authority of the newly established English Church. The Reformation also altered the spiritual landscape for ordinary English people. The familiar rituals, traditions, and allegiances to Rome were replaced by royal decrees, new prayers, and a king-dominated clergy. Obedience to Henry became a measure of faith itself. What began as a private matter of love and inheritance became a seismic shift in religion, law, and power. The English Reformation was not just a political maneuver, it was a declaration that the crown, not the church, would define the fate of England. In breaking with Rome, Henry VIII reshaped a nation, altered the course of Christianity in England, and set the stage for decades of religious conflict, ambition, and intrigue. Catherine of Aragon, once celebrated as England's virtuous and devout queen, now faced the devastating consequences of Henry VIII's obsession with Anne Boleyn. The woman who had been admired for her dignity, intelligence, and steadfast faith was stripped of her status, her influence, and the security of her position. Overnight, Catherine went from queen to outcast, exiled from the court she had once ruled with grace. Her fall was as public as it was painful. Henry declared their marriage null and void, citing biblical law to justify the annulment, while the newly established Church of England reinforced his authority. Catherine's lifelong devotion and loyalty were dismissed. Despite her protests, her legal and spiritual claims were ignored. The court, once her stage, now whispered with judgment and cruelty as allies abandoned her and rivals seized opportunities to curry favor with the king. Yet Catherine remained unbowed. She refused to recognize Anne as queen, steadfastly maintaining her rightful place in Henry's eyes and in God's. Letters of protest and appeals to foreign courts became her weapons, though they could not overturn the king's will. Her dignity became both her shield and her prison. She was admired for her moral strength, even as her life became increasingly constrained. Isolation weighed heavily. Catherine was moved from palace to palace, her movements controlled, her circle limited. Friends and servants were carefully monitored. Even her daughter, Mary, was declared illegitimate, cutting off her claim to the throne. In the eyes of Henry and the new church, Catherine was no longer queen. She was a relic of a marriage the king had repudiated. The fall of Catherine of Aragon was not merely a personal tragedy. It marked the beginning of a new era in England, where royal will superseded tradition. Personal desire could reshape the church, and women, no matter their virtue, could be cast aside to serve the ambitions of a king. Catherine's grace in exile would become legend, a testament to endurance in the face of absolute power. In 1533, Anne Boleyn achieved what many thought impossible. She was crowned Queen of England. The coronation was a spectacle of pageantry, music, and religious ritual, designed to announce her arrival not just as Henry VIII's bride, but as the new center of power in the realm. The streets of London were lined with cheering crowds, banners fluttered, and trumpets heralded the triumph of a woman who had defied convention to claim a crown. Anne's rise was a triumph of ambition, intelligence, and strategy. She had refused to be a mistress, insisting that she would only marry Henry, and through patience, manipulation, and subtle diplomacy, she had won. Her intelligence, charm, and wit made her both admired and feared at court. Allies aligned behind her, eager to benefit from her favor, while rivals watched anxiously, knowing that her influence could elevate or destroy anyone who crossed her. Yet Anne's queenship was precarious. She had supplanted Catherine of Aragon, beloved by many, and the religious schism Henry had created to marry her left her legitimacy open to debate. Every decision, every appearance, every word was scrutinized. Anne's intellect became her armor, but her ambition made her vulnerable to jealousy and rumor. As queen, she brought innovation to the court. She encouraged reformist ideas, patronized the arts, and displayed the sophistication of her European education. But behind the splendor, the pressure to produce a male heir weighed heavily. The entire kingdom, including the king, waited for proof that Anne could secure the Tudor dynasty. Anne Boleyn's queenship was brilliant, bold, and fraught with danger. She had achieved her lifelong goal, yet her position depended on a single measure, a son. In the opulence of coronation and courtly influence lay the seeds of tension, suspicion, and tragedy. For the very qualities that elevated Anne to the throne would later contribute to her dramatic and fatal downfall. The birth of Princess Elizabeth in 1533 was both the cause for celebration and a source of disappointment for Henry VIII. Anne Boleyn at last had given birth, but the child was a girl, not the longed-for son who would secure the Tudor dynasty and satisfy the king's obsession with male succession. Bells rang, prayers were offered, and the court rejoiced at the safe delivery of a healthy child, yet the king's expression betrayed his frustration. England's future seemed uncertain once again. Henry's desire for a male heir had been the driving force behind his break with Rome and the English Reformation. Every action, from annulling his marriage to Catherine of Aragon to severing ties with the Pope, had been justified by the need for a son. Now, with Elizabeth's birth, the king faced a cruel twist of fate. A daughter, though adored and cherished, could not carry the Tudor name in the same way a son could. The court's reaction was mixed. Reformers and Anne's supporters celebrated, seeing hope and continuity in Elizabeth's arrival. Yet traditionalists and critics whispered doubts. They questioned Anne's ability to provide the king with the heir he needed and speculated whether divine favor had abandoned the new queen. For Anne, the joy of motherhood was overshadowed by anxiety. Her position at court, already precarious due to enemies eager to see her fall, now rested entirely on her ability to produce a son in the future. Despite the disappointment, Elizabeth's birth marked the emergence of a brilliant mind and future monarch. Anne nurtured her with care, aware that her daughter would one day navigate the dangerous tides of Tudor politics. But for Henry, Elizabeth's arrival was a reminder that even the crown could not guarantee certainty. The king's obsession with a male heir would intensify, and the pressure on Anne would grow ever more relentless, setting in motion events that would shape the destiny of England for decades to come. By the mid-1530s, the atmosphere at Henry VIII's court had transformed from celebration to tension, suspicion, and fear. Anne Boleyn's queenship, once dazzling and promising, had begun to strain under the immense pressure of expectations. Every whispered conversation, every sideways glance, and every courtly gesture was scrutinized for hidden meaning. Courtiers moved cautiously, aware that favor could vanish as quickly as it appeared, and that misstep could be deadly. Henry himself became increasingly unpredictable. The king, obsessed with securing a male heir, scrutinized Anne with a growing intensity. Miscarriages, failed pregnancies, and the birth of a daughter had fueled his frustration. Paranoia seeped into his mind. Did Anne secretly resent him? Was she plotting against him? Were her allies conspiring to undermine his authority? Every loyal subject, every trusted advisor suddenly became a potential threat in his eyes. Anne, once confident and assertive, felt the subtle shift. Courtiers who had praised her wit now whispered behind closed doors. Enemies she had once outmaneuvered looked for any sign of weakness to exploit. The very intelligence and charm that had elevated her to queenship now painted a target on her back. Alliances became fragile. Loyalties were tested daily. In this climate, Anne's position was increasingly precarious. Every word she spoke, every action she took was judged, not only for politeness, but for potential betrayal. The golden splendor of her queenship began to tarnish, replaced by tension and uncertainty. Paranoia had become the currency of power, and at Henry's court, survival depended as much on perception as on loyalty. By 1536, the atmosphere at Henry VIII's court had shifted from fascination to fear. Anne Boleyn, once the fiery, ambitious queen who had captured the king's heart, now faced a storm of accusations that threatened her very life. The whispers that had long circulated about her temper, her intelligence, her independence were now weaponized. She was charged with adultery, incest, and treason, crimes that carried a single inevitable punishment: death. The accusations were as shocking as they were politically convenient. Henry's desire for a male heir had remained unfulfilled, and his obsession with securing the dynasty intensified. Anne's enemies, eager to regain favor and eliminate a rival, seized upon every rumor and minor indiscretion to construct a case against her. Men close to Anne, some coerced and some seeking self-preservation, were implicated. Evidence, often fabricated or exaggerated, painted a portrait of a queen who had betrayed both husband and crown. Anne's reaction was one of measured defiance. She maintained her innocence, refusing to admit guilt to charges that were absurd even by Tudor standards. Yet the machinery of justice in Henry's England was not impartial. The king's will was law, and the court became an instrument of his judgment. Judges, jurors, and officials moved in accordance with royal expectation, ensuring that the outcome would lead to the one the king demanded. The charges were more than legal accusations. They were a reflection of the dangerous intersection of ambition, jealousy, and absolute power. In a court where favor could shift with a glance, Anne's fall of grace became a cautionary tale. The queen who had once captivated a king with charm and intellect now faced a fate as public as her rise had been spectacular, her life hanging by the thinnest thread of political necessity and royal desire. The stage was set for one of the most infamous executions in English history. May 19, 1536, a date that would be etched in history as the day Anne Boleyn, once Queen of England, faced the ultimate judgment. The morning air over the Tower of London was cold and gray, a stark contrast to the splendor that had marked her rise to power. Crowds gathered silently outside the fortress walls, some in morbid curiosity, others in reverent sorrow. Anne walked through the gates, composed and dignified, her posture regal even in the shadow of death. She had been found guilty of adultery, incest, and treason, charges historians now believe were fabricated to satisfy Henry VIII's desire for a new marriage and a male heir. Yet Anne faced her fate with remarkable courage. She wore a modest gown, her hair bound neatly beneath a coif, and carried herself with the composure of a woman fully aware of her own dignity. Her final prayers, whispered to God, were as much a testament to faith as to defiance. On the scaffold, Anne addressed the assembled crowd with calm and clarity. She spoke of innocence, loyalty, and forgiveness, demonstrating a bravery that transcended fear. The executioner, a skilled swordsman from France, brought in for his precision, waited patiently. Anne knelt, offering her neck, her final moments marked not by panic, but by grace. The blade fell swiftly, ending a life that had captivated a king, divided a nation, and ignited a religious revolution. In that instant, Anne Boleyn became more than a queen. She became a symbol, a warning of the dangers of ambition, the volatility of favor, and the absolute power of a monarch. The execution sent shockwaves through England. The court was stunned. The populace whispered in fear and fascination. And Henry VIII, moments later, began plotting the next steps of his dynastic ambition. Anne's death was not merely a personal tragedy. It was a turning point in English history, where love, ambition, and the crown collided with fatal consequence. In the wake of Anne Boleyn's dramatic fall, the Tudor court teetered between grief, relief, and anticipation. Into this turbulent landscape stepped Jane Seymour, a young woman of quiet beauty, gentle demeanor, and unwavering devotion. Unlike Anne, Jane was not ambitious in a way that threatened the king. She was careful, compliant, and attentive, qualities that immediately appealed to Henry VIII after the chaos and scandal surrounding his previous queen. Jane's arrival at court was understated yet calculated. She observed the politics of the court silently, navigating alliances and rivalries with discretion. Her intelligence was subtle, expressed not in bold declarations or defiance, but in her ability to listen, respond appropriately, and remain morally unassailable. In her, Henry saw an ideal combination of beauty, piety, and obedience, a queen who could soothe the king's ego and restore stability to a court exhausted by intrigue and betrayal. The king's attention quickly turned to Jane. Unlike Anne, she did not challenge him or manipulate her position for power. She allowed Henry to lead, cultivating his affection through attentiveness and grace rather than resistance. Their courtship was formal but steady, marked by Henry's growing admiration for her patience and loyalty. In Jane, Henry saw the promise of a domestic harmony that had been absent during the turbulence of his earlier marriages. By 1536, Jane Seymour had risen from obscurity to become the king's chosen bride. Her ascent was quiet but deliberate, supported by those who recognized that Henry craved stability and an heir above all else. Jane embodied the Tudor ideal of a queen, devoted, unthreatening, and capable of producing the long-awaited male successor. Her rise marked a turning point. Where Anne had challenged Henry and reshaped the court through defiance, Jane's method was subtle obedience. In doing so, she secured not only the king's favor, but the hope of a dynasty, a hope that would soon rest in her ability to give England the son Henry had long demanded. Jane Seymour's queenship was defined by a quiet, steady presence that contrasted sharply with the drama and ambition of her predecessor, Anne Boleyn. Where Anne had wielded charm and defiance like weapons, Jane relied on obedience, patience, and humility, qualities that appealed deeply to Henry VIII, who had grown weary of intrigue and conflict at court. Her comportment projected stability, offering the king a vision of domestic order and reassurance that his desires for a male heir could finally be fulfilled. From the moment she became queen, Jane understood her role. She performed her duties with meticulous attention, appearing at court functions with grace and decorum, supporting the king in public and avoiding the political maneuvering that had doomed Anne. She allowed Henry to lead, fostering his ego while quietly maintaining her influence through loyalty rather than confrontation. Courtiers quickly recognized that Jane's presence stabilized the often volatile court, and her reputation for modesty and propriety made her a model Tudor queen in the eyes of the nobility and the public alike. Henry, captivated by her gentle nature, began to invest in Jane not only as a wife, but as a symbol of continuity for the dynasty. Unlike his previous marriages, there were no public quarrels, no whispers of scandal, only a steady partnership, carefully cultivated. Jane's ability to navigate the expectations of queenship with subtlety and tact strengthened her position, earning the admiration of those around her while maintaining Henry's affection. Most importantly, Jane's submission was strategic. By aligning herself with the king's desires rather than resisting them, she secured her influence and positioned herself to fulfill the ultimate expectation of her queenship, producing a male heir. In her quiet compliance, Jane Seymour became the embodiment of Tudor ideals, a queen whose gentleness and devotion shaped both her reign and the future of England.
The promise of stability and continuation of the Tudor dynasty rested on a single expectation, a male heir. For years, Henry VIII had pursued marriage after marriage, desperate for a son to secure the future of England. With Jane Seymour, hope returned. Her gentle demeanor, loyalty, and devotion seemed perfectly suited to the king's ambitions, and the court watched with anticipation as she carried the kingdom's and the king's greatest desire within her womb. Jane's pregnancy was met with cautious optimism. Every movement, every doctor's report, and every whispered detail of her health was scrutinized by Henry and the courtiers alike. The nation held its collective breath. England had waited for a male heir through wars, divorces, and political upheaval, and now that hope rested entirely on the Queen's shoulders. In October 1537, Jane gave birth to a son, Edward, the long-awaited symbol of Tudor continuity. The joy was immense. Bells rang, prayers were offered, and the court celebrated the arrival of a prince who promised to secure the dynasty for generations. Henry's relief was palpable. At last, his obsession with a male heir had been satisfied. The infant Edward was more than a child. He was the embodiment of political stability, national pride, and personal triumph for the king. Yet the joy was fleeting. Jane's life had been consumed by the physical demands of pregnancy and childbirth, and complications arose. Just days after the birth, Jane Seymour fell gravely ill, her gentle strength no longer enough to sustain her. Despite every effort by the king's physicians, the queen's life slipped away, leaving Henry grief-stricken and the court stunned. Jane Seymour's death marked a bittersweet victory. She had given England a son, fulfilling the king's deepest desire, but at the cost of her life. In her sacrifice, Jane secured her place in history, remembered not for intrigue or scandal, but for devotion, obedience, and the birth of Edward VI, the heir who would carry the Tudor legacy forward. The court of Henry VIII was plunged in mourning in late October 1537. Jane Seymour, the gentle queen who had restored a sense of stability and promise to the turbulent Tudor court, had succumbed to complications just days after giving birth to the long-awaited male heir, Prince Edward. Her death was a shocking reminder of the dangers of childbirth in the 16th century, even for queens, and it left the king grief-stricken and the nation in sorrow. Jane's passing marked the first time Henry experienced the loss of a wife after achieving what he had desired most, a son to secure the Tudor dynasty. Edward's birth was a triumph of dynastic ambition, but Jane's death underscored the fragile human cost behind political and personal desires. Courtiers, advisors, and nobles mourned publicly, while Henry privately wrestled with grief, a mix of genuine loss
and the anxiety of planning the future once more. The Queen's death was treated with solemn ceremony. Jane's body lay in state, adorned in regal vestments, reflecting both her royal status and the reverence she commanded even in death. Processions through the streets of London allowed the public to pay respects to a queen whose life had been defined by quiet devotion rather than courtly intrigue. Her influence lingered in the policies she had supported, the harmony she had fostered in the court, and, most importantly, in the infant prince whose life ensured the continuation of the Tudor line. Henry VIII's grief was complex. Jane had been a compliant and devoted queen, offering him stability and fulfilling his desire for a son. Yet her passing forced him to confront the impermanence of both life and power. Jane Seymour would be remembered as the queen who gave Henry the heir he craved, her death forever entwined with triumph, loss, and the unrelenting demands of monarchy. By the late 1530s, Henry VIII was no longer the vibrant, athletic young king who had captured Europe's attention. Years of excess, illness, and the pressures of absolute power had begun to take their toll, leaving him increasingly isolated and irritable. The once charismatic ruler, admired for his energy and charm, now bore the marks of indulgence and relentless ambition. His health faltered, his mobility declined, and his temper grew shorter, feeding a reputation for cruelty and unpredictability. The deaths of his wives, the political upheavals, and the weight of reshaping a nation in his image had exacted a heavy toll. Henry's obsession with securing the Tudor dynasty had consumed him, driving his decisions in both personal and political life. The court, once a celebration and intrigue, now operated under tension and fear, where loyalty was enforced and dissent punished swiftly. Allies became cautious, courtiers cautious in speech and gesture, aware that Henry's favor could vanish overnight. Henry's focus remained fixed on succession and power. Edward, Jane Seymour's son, represented the future, but the king's anxiety over the continuation of his lineage was relentless. Each marriage, each political maneuver, each new alliance was weighed against the needs of the dynasty. The court observed as Henry navigated these pressures with increasing severity, often turning suspicion into swift and deadly action. In private, Henry's physical decline mirrored his moral and emotional isolation. The king who had once danced, jousted, and hunted tirelessly now struggled with obesity, illness, and constant pain. Yet his will remained ironclad. His vision for England's future demanded unwavering obedience and total control. By this point, Henry VIII had transformed from a celebrated Renaissance prince into a monarch defined by fear, authority, and obsession, a king in decline, whose personal desires and relentless ambition would continue to shape England long after his death. After the death of Jane Seymour, Henry VIII's court once again became a stage for political maneuvering, ambition, and intrigue. The king, grieving the loss of a wife who had given him the male heir he so desperately desired, now faced the urgent need to secure alliances and stabilize his reign. In this turbulent environment, another marriage became not just a personal decision, but a political necessity. Catherine Howard, a young and vivacious cousin of Anne Boleyn, emerged as the new focus of Henry's attention. Unlike Anne, whose intelligence and ambition had both captivated and challenged the king, Catherine was charming, compliant, and outwardly obedient. Her beauty and youth appealed to Henry's vanity, while her family connections offered renewed ties to the influential Howard dynasty. The match promised not only personal satisfaction for the aging monarch, but also strategic advantages, reinforcing alliances among England's most powerful noble families. The court responded to the engagement with cautious excitement. Advisors, courtiers, and foreign diplomats all recognized the significance of the king's choice. A queen could legitimize succession, strengthen political alliances, and stabilize the fragile balance of power within the realm. Every gesture, every ceremony, and every public display was carefully orchestrated to demonstrate Henry's authority and the unshakable status of the crown. Yet, beneath the surface, danger simmered. Catherine's youth and inexperience made her vulnerable, while the legacy of Henry's previous marriages, divorces, executions, and scandals hung over the court like a dark shadow. The pressures of queenship would test her at every turn, and the king's unpredictable temperament meant that favor could vanish as suddenly as it had come. Once again, marriage in Henry VIII's court was less about strategy than strategy, a tool to shape politics, secure dynastic continuity, and control the volatile world of Tudor England. In choosing Catherine Howard, Henry prepared for a union that would bring both desire and danger, setting the stage for another dramatic chapter in the history of his 6 wives. By 1540, Henry VIII's court was weary of intrigue, scandal, and the shadows left by his previous marriages. The king, now middle-aged, overweight, and increasingly irritable, sought a queen who could provide stability, political alliance, and companionship. It was in this context that Anne of Cleves, a German princess from the Protestant Duchy of Cleves, entered the picture, a marriage arranged not for love, but for diplomacy. Anne's arrival in England was heralded with ceremony, her portrait having preceded her. Henry's hopes were high. A foreign queen promised strengthened alliances with Protestant states in Northern Europe, bolstering England's position against France and the Holy Roman Empire. Yet the king's expectations would clash with reality. Upon meeting Anne, Henry was reportedly disappointed. Her appearance and manner did not match the flattering portraits he had received. Despite her intelligence, poise, and gentle nature, Henry found himself disenchanted almost immediately. Anne, for her part, navigated her new environment with remarkable composure. She was aware of the precariousness of her position, a stranger in a foreign land, married to a king whose temper and desires could shift unpredictably. She approached her role with patience, dignity, and adherence to courtly expectations, seeking neither to provoke nor to dominate. Her intelligence and courtesy earned her some favor at court, but she could not alter the king's initial impression. The marriage, though politically advantageous on paper, quickly revealed its fragility. Henry's disinterest and disappointment threatened to undermine Anne's security, leaving her vulnerable to the court's gossip and the king's impulsive decisions. What began as a calculated diplomatic union became a test of survival, adaptability, and tact. Anne of Cleves' arrival marked a turning point in Henry's matrimonial saga. Her presence would challenge the king's temper, the court's expectations, and the limits of diplomacy, demonstrating that even a politically arranged marriage could be fraught with tension, personal disappointment, and historical consequence. The wedding of Henry VIII and Anne of Cleves on January 6, 1540, was meant to solidify alliances and restore stability to the Tudor court. Yet what was intended as a grand diplomatic triumph quickly became a personal embarrassment for the king. Henry, already middle-aged and increasingly self-conscious about his appearance and health, had been misled by a flattering portrait of Anne. When he first saw her in person on their wedding day, his disappointment was immediate and palpable. The ceremony, held at the Palace of Greenwich, was lavish and carefully orchestrated to impress both domestic and foreign dignitaries. Nobles, courtiers, and ambassadors gathered in anticipation, eager to witness the union that promised to strengthen England's ties with Protestant states in Northern Europe. The pageantry included ornate gowns, gilded decorations, and the pomp typical of Tudor royal weddings. Yet beneath the surface, tension simmered. Henry's reaction to Anne was unmistakable. He reportedly declared that he could not endure conjugal life with her, citing her appearance and expressing regret at the union. Anne, for her part, conducted herself with remarkable composure. She had entered the marriage as a dutiful political bride, aware that her safety and position depended entirely on the king's favor. She maintained decorum throughout the ceremony, offering the obedience and courtesy expected of a queen, even as she sensed Henry's disillusionment. The ceremony immediately became a source of humiliation and gossip. Courtiers whispered of the king's displeasure, the mismatch between expectations and reality, and the potential fallout for Anne. Within weeks, the political necessity of the marriage would collide with personal dissatisfaction, leading Henry to seek a solution that would spare him further embarrassment. The marriage to Anne of Cleves was a turning point. It highlighted the limits of diplomacy in the Tudor court, exposed the king's vanity, and set the stage for an unprecedented annulment that would humiliate the queen while altering the trajectory of England's royal history. The union between Henry VIII and Anne of Cleves quickly revealed an unexpected and extraordinary complication. The marriage was never consummated. Despite the pomp and ceremony of their wedding, Henry found himself unable to connect with Anne, citing her appearance, temperament, and, according to reports, a lack of physical attraction. What should have been a celebrated royal alliance instead became a personal and political dilemma, fraught with embarrassment for the king and uncertainty for the queen. Henry's disillusionment grew rapidly. In private chambers and whispered courtly discussions, he expressed regret, declaring that he could not share the intimate bond expected of a husband and wife. Anne, for her part, faced the challenge with remarkable composure. She had entered the marriage dutifully, understanding the political and personal stakes. Though young and far from home, she maintained decorum, avoiding confrontations and navigating the king's displeasure with patience and dignity. The lack of consummation carried profound legal and political significance. In Tudor England, an unconsummated marriage could be annulled more easily, and Henry's advisors encouraged him to pursue this route. For Anne, it was a delicate situation. She had to protect her honor, maintain her position, and navigate the dangerous tides of a court where the king's favor determined both survival and status. The situation quickly became a public matter. Courtiers speculated about the king's dissatisfaction, and the failure of the marriage sparked gossip in London and across Europe. Diplomats reported on Henry's frustration and Anne's calm acceptance, noting the unusual circumstances of a queen whose role was unfulfilled not through her own fault, but through royal preference. Ultimately, the unconsummated marriage set the stage for a remarkable resolution. Anne of Cleves would be spared the tragic fates of some of Henry's other wives, yet her experience highlighted the fragility of queenship, the king's mercurial desires, and the complex interplay of personal and political imperatives in the Tudor court. In July 1540, the marriage between Henry VIII and Anne of Cleves was formally annulled, sparing the German princess from the tragic fates that had befallen other queens. Unlike Anne Boleyn or Catherine Howard, Anne of Cleves emerged from the ordeal alive. Her survival owed to a combination of political prudence, personal composure, and the king's desire to avoid further scandal. The annulment was framed as a legal and religious solution. The marriage had never been consummated, providing Henry with a convenient justification that satisfied both church and crown. Anne accepted the annulment with grace, a rare quality in a court accustomed to intrigue and peril. She retained her title as the king's sister, a designation that afforded her respect, income, and residence in England. Granted several estates, including Hever Castle and Richmond Palace, Anne lived comfortably, maintaining a dignified presence at court while largely removed from its political machinations. Her obedience, humility, and lack of ambition earned her favor and protection, ensuring she would not provoke Henry's wrath or courtly jealousy. Despite the annulment, Anne retained a cordial relationship with the king. Henry admired her composure and reportedly appreciated her company, even referring to her as the king's beloved sister. This unusual arrangement allowed Anne a unique position in Tudor history, a former queen who survived, respected, and quietly influential without becoming a threat to the monarchy or a pawn in European politics. Anne of Cleves' survival was remarkable in an era when queens often faced execution for political missteps, failure to produce heirs, or royal displeasure. Her story demonstrates the delicate balance of diplomacy, obedience, and personal restraint required to navigate the treacherous waters of Henry VIII's court. By surviving where others fell, Anne became a symbol of resilience and prudence, her life a testament to the power of patience and grace in the dangerous world of Tudor England. In 1540, following the annulment of his marriage to Anne of Cleves, Henry VIII sought yet another wife, turning his attention to Catherine Howard, a young and vivacious cousin of Anne Boleyn. Catherine, barely in her late teens, arrived at court full of charm, beauty, and naivety, a stark contrast to the intelligence and political savvy of Henry's previous queens. Her youth and exuberance immediately captivated the aging king, who saw in her a source of pleasure, excitement, and distraction from the weight of his responsibilities. Catherine's rise to queenship was swift. She was elevated from the household of her step-grandmother, the Dowager Duchess of Norfolk, into the center of Tudor power, quickly capturing Henry's favor. The court marveled at her vivacity. She was lively, flirtatious, and radiant in appearance, embodying the king's desire for a young, obedient companion. Yet beneath her beauty lay inexperience and a lack of understanding of the treacherous dynamics of the Tudor court. Unlike Anne Boleyn or Jane Seymour, Catherine had little sense of political strategy, and her past, filled with youthful indiscretions and relationships, would soon become a dangerous liability. Her marriage to Henry initially appeared blissful. The king indulged her whims, lavished her with attention, and rewarded her family, who benefited from her position. Catherine seemed to bring a sense of joy and renewal to the court, offering a temporary reprieve from the political and dynastic pressures that had dominated Henry's previous marriages. Yet, her inexperience and past mistakes would soon catch up with her. Court spies and rivals quietly gathered evidence of her prior relationships, and rumors began to circulate. Catherine's charm and vivacity, once assets, became sources of vulnerability. In Henry's court, where suspicion and power were inseparable, her past would determine her fate, foreshadowing a dramatic downfall that no beauty or innocence could avert. With Catherine Howard now queen, Henry VIII experienced a rare resurgence of vitality and youthful energy. The young, vivacious Catherine rekindled a sense of excitement and desire in the aging monarch, reminding him of the passion and flirtation of his early years. For the first time in decades, the king's court buzzed with gossip and laughter, as Henry seemed lighter, more indulgent, and willing to embrace the pleasures of life once more. Catherine's charm was intoxicating to Henry. Her laughter, beauty, and playful demeanor offered a stark contrast to the formality and political calculation of previous queens. The king, who had grown increasingly heavy, infirm, and irritable, appeared invigorated in her presence. He rode, hunted, and attended court functions with renewed enthusiasm, eager to please his young bride and enjoy her attention. Courtiers marveled at the transformation. The formidable, aging king was once again enchanted, animated, and even flirtatious. The influence of Catherine Howard extended beyond Henry's mood. Her energy brought liveliness to the court itself, with festivities, tournaments, and celebrations reflecting the king's newfound delight. Nobles sought her favor, aware that Catherine's proximity to the king could determine political and financial advantage. Yet this same influence carried risk. Her past indiscretions and inexperience made her vulnerable, and the court's gossip began to swirl even as Henry basked in the apparent joy of his new marriage. For Henry, Catherine represented more than companionship. She symbolized a fleeting return to youth, desire, and confidence. In her presence, he was temporarily freed from the burdens of illness, past heartbreak, and the weight of ruling a kingdom. The court watched as the king, once embattled by paranoia and obsession, seemed revitalized, proving that even in his later years, Henry VIII could be enchanted, enthralled, and, for a brief moment, feel young again.
Beneath the glittering ceremonies and lavish halls of Henry VIII's court, shadows moved silently, carrying whispers, secrets, and the weight of unspoken truths. By 1541, the king's marriage to Catherine Howard seemed to radiate joy and vitality, yet hidden beneath her youthful charm lay a past that threatened to ignite scandal and tragedy. Courtiers, ever observant and opportunistic, watched with keen interest, gathering information that could be leveraged for influence or survival. Catherine's prior indiscretions, casual flirtations, and secret liaisons from her youth had been largely ignored in the excitement of her rise to queenship. But the Tudor court was unforgiving, and nothing remained hidden for long. Gossip began to circulate quietly, whispered in corridors and private chambers, hinting at behavior that could be deemed inappropriate or even treasonous. Those who had once admired her beauty now waited for missteps, sensing the king's volatile temper could turn rumors into lethal accusations. The court itself became a theater of intrigue. Spies and informants moved unseen, collecting letters, observing meetings, and reporting every suspicious glance or comment. Even allies of Catherine recognized the danger. Loyalty in Henry's England was conditional, dependent on favor and the perception of virtue. One misplaced word, a single scandalous rumor, could alter the trajectory of power, reputation, and life itself. For Henry, these secrets were dangerous fuel for his unpredictable fury. The king, already suspicious and driven by obsession, did not need proof. Mere insinuations could ignite his wrath. Catherine's past, once irrelevant, now became a shadow that followed her, threatening the very crown she wore. In the silent corridors of power, the game of observation and deception intensified, and secrets from the shadows moved toward revelation, foreshadowing a fall that would shock the court and alter the fate of the young queen forever. By late 1541, the fragile illusion of Catherine Howard's queenship began to crumble.
Rumors of her past, youthful indiscretions and secret flirtations had circulated quietly for months, but now evidence emerged that would shatter her position entirely. Letters, testimonies, and confessions from her former companions painted a picture of a queen whose behavior, though largely before her marriage, was considered morally and politically unacceptable in the unforgiving world of Henry VIII's court. The court, long accustomed to intrigue and scandal, braced for the king's reaction. Henry, already wary and increasingly suspicious, was reportedly stunned and enraged by the revelations. Catherine's youth and beauty, which had once charmed the aging monarch, now offered no protection. The allegations of infidelity and dishonesty were framed not just as personal betrayal, but as a direct threat to the Tudor dynasty and the sanctity of the crown. Catherine's fall was swift. Arrested and confined to the Tower of London, she faced interrogation and pressure to confess. The atmosphere was tense. Courtiers and advisors knew that proximity to the Queen could be dangerous, and many distanced themselves to preserve favor. Even her family, whose influence had helped elevate her, could do little to intervene. The machinery of Tudor justice moved efficiently and without mercy. For Henry VIII, Catherine's betrayal, real or perceived, was intolerable. The king's wrath, fueled by both personal hurt and dynastic concern, demanded resolution. Catherine, once celebrated for her vivacity and charm, now became the subject of scrutiny, humiliation, and condemnation. Her fall was a stark reminder that in Henry's England, a queen's survival depended not only on favor, but on unquestionable virtue, obedience, and the king's unwavering approval. Betrayal, whether by intent or circumstance, could not be tolerated. The exposure of Catherine Howard's secrets marked one of the most dramatic and tragic chapters in the saga of Henry VIII's 6 wives, setting the stage for her imminent execution and the court's renewed caution.
Catherine Howard's fall of grace was as swift as it was devastating. Once celebrated for her beauty, charm, and vivacity, the young queen now faced the full force of Henry VIII's wrath. The evidence of her past indiscretions, combined with her perceived disloyalty, transformed her from the king's adored companion into a traitor in the eyes of Tudor England. At barely 19, Catherine had become a cautionary tale of ambition, naivety, and the dangerous allure of youth in a court ruled by fear and absolute power. Confined to the Tower of London, Catherine endured interrogations that exposed the details of her relationships before and during her marriage. Witnesses were questioned, letters scrutinized, and former companions coerced into revealing incriminating information. Every revelation heightened the tension, and the young queen, once the center of attention and admiration, found herself isolated, powerless, and facing a court that now whispered only of betrayal and scandal. Henry's anger was merciless. The king, who had once delighted in Catherine's energy and vivacity, now demanded justice for what he saw as a personal and political affront. The court understood that in Henry's England, a queen who failed to uphold virtue and obedience risked the ultimate punishment. Even her family, who had benefited from her rise, could do little to shield her from the consequences of her actions. On the scaffold, Catherine faced her fate with a fragile courage, but the court and country watched in shock. Her execution was a stark reminder of the precariousness of queenship under Henry VIII, where youth and beauty offered no protection against ambition, rumor, or royal wrath. The fall of Catherine Howard demonstrated the deadly intersection of personal desire, political power, and the unforgiving expectations of the Tudor monarchy, a girl queen destroyed by the very system that had elevated her.
February 13th, 1542 marked a grim chapter in the saga of Henry VIII's wives, the execution of Catherine Howard, the second queen to lose her life at the hands of the king. Barely in her late teens, Catherine had risen swiftly from obscurity to the pinnacle of power, only to fall as dramatically under the unforgiving scrutiny of the Tudor court. Her youth, beauty, and charm, once celebrated, now offered no protection against the wrath of a king determined to enforce his authority and punish perceived betrayal. The Tower of London, silent and cold, became the stage for her final moments. Catherine, aware of the inevitability of her fate, faced the scaffold with a mixture of fear and fragile courage. She had been accused of adultery and treason, charges that, in the Tudor era, left little room for mercy. The court, which had once marveled at her vivacity, now gathered in a tense, watchful silence, witnessing the tragic consequences of royal displeasure. Catherine's execution was swift but public, intended as a warning to all who might challenge the king or defy the rigid moral and political expectations of the monarchy. Her words, spoken with trembling dignity, expressed repentance and a plea for forgiveness. For Henry, the execution reinforced his authority and demonstrated that personal desire could not override the crown's absolute power. The death of Catherine Howard sent shockwaves through England, reminding the nobility and commoners alike that favor at court was fleeting and royal anger could be deadly. In the shadow of the scaffold, the young queen became a symbol of vulnerability in a world where ambition, naivety, and the king's volatile temper could collide with fatal consequences. Execution number 2 cemented the pattern of Henry VIII's reign: love, lust, and politics entwined with danger, often ending in bloodshed. By 1542, the relentless cycle of marriages, betrayals, and executions had taken its toll on Henry VIII. The king, once vibrant, athletic, and full of charm, now bore the physical and emotional scars of decades of indulgence, obsession, and power struggles. His once commanding presence had been diminished by obesity, illness, and chronic pain, and the crown, though still secure, could not shield him from the psychological weight of loss and paranoia. The deaths of Anne Boleyn and Catherine Howard, both executed for perceived transgressions, haunted Henry. Each queen had embodied different facets of his desires and ambitions. Anne, ambitious and defiant; Catherine, youthful and vivacious. Both had risen and fallen under his gaze, leaving the king increasingly isolated and suspicious of those around him. The court, aware of Henry's volatility, moved cautiously, curtsying, whispering, and obeying in ways that reflected fear more than loyalty. Physically, Henry struggled with injuries, obesity, and infections that limited his mobility. Mentally, he oscillated between pride, rage, and melancholy, grappling with the consequences of a life defined by desire, control, and relentless pursuit of an heir. The exhilaration of power was tempered by the knowledge that even kings were vulnerable to betrayal, misjudgment, and the limitations of their own bodies. Yet Henry remained resolute. The dynasty he had fought to secure, the Tudor line, was safeguarded through the birth of his children, particularly Edward. Despite his decline, the king wielded authority with an iron hand, reminding England that absolute power, though costly, remained unchallenged. By 1542, Henry VIII was a broken man in many ways, physically weakened, emotionally scarred, and wary of those closest to him. The tragedies of love, ambition, and betrayal had shaped a king who, despite his failings, continued to dominate England. His personal pain, intertwined with the unyielding demands of monarchy, legacy, and survival. By 1543, Henry VIII's court had grown wary of the king's whims, the deadly patterns of his previous marriages still fresh in memory. Into this turbulent environment stepped Catherine Parr, a woman of intelligence, composure, and experience. Twice widowed before meeting Henry, Catherine was older than many of the king's previous wives and possessed a maturity that set her apart. Her reputation for piety, diplomacy, and discretion made her uniquely suited to navigate the dangerous waters of the Tudor court. Catherine approached the role of queen with calculated grace. She understood the importance of balancing obedience with influence, ensuring that her opinions were heard without provoking the king's notorious temper. Unlike Anne Boleyn or Catherine Howard, she did not seek to dominate Henry or challenge his authority. Instead, she provided counsel, companionship, and a stabilizing presence. Her intellect allowed her to engage with the king on religious and political matters, carefully advancing her positions without overstepping boundaries. The marriage also offered Catherine a degree of security unusual in Henry's court. Her prior experience and careful diplomacy shielded her from scandal, while her genuine devotion to the king earned his respect and affection. She quickly established herself as a respected figure in the palace, mediating disputes, managing the household, and nurturing Henry's children, who had survived previous family upheavals. Catherine Parr's queenship marked a stark contrast to the dramatic rises and tragic falls of Henry's earlier wives. Where others had fallen victim to ambition, youth, or the king's desires, Catherine relied on prudence, intellect, and tact to survive. She became not only a caretaker of Henry, but also a mentor to his children, particularly Elizabeth and Edward, shaping the next generation of Tudor rulers. In an era when queens were often pawns or casualties, Catherine Parr's story demonstrates the power of wisdom, restraint, and strategy. Her marriage to Henry VIII was a triumph of survival, influence, and careful navigation of one of history's most dangerous courts. By the time Catherine Parr married Henry VIII in 1443, the king was older, heavier, and increasingly frail. The violent dramas of his previous marriages, executions, betrayals, and scandals, had left the court cautious and tense. Into this atmosphere stepped Catherine, whose intelligence, poise, and experience made her ideally suited for a role that demanded both loyalty and subtle influence. Unlike her predecessors, Catherine was not a fiery temptress or a naive girl. She was a caretaker, diplomat, and stabilizing presence in a court shaped by danger and fear. Catherine's approach to queenship was strategic. She balanced devotion to Henry with a quiet influence over his decisions, offering counsel on political and religious matters without provoking his temper. She maintained her dignity and intelligence, earning the king's respect while avoiding the jealousy and suspicion that had doomed previous wives. Her experience and calm demeanor allowed her to manage a household still haunted by intrigue, ensuring the royal children were cared for and educated amid the turbulence of Tudor life. In her role, Catherine became more than a queen consort. She was a guardian of the dynasty. She mediated between factions at court, smoothing tensions and fostering stability. She encouraged Henry's children, Elizabeth and Edward, to pursue learning and piety, subtly shaping the minds of the future monarchs. While she could not reverse the tragedies of Henry's past marriages, her presence provided the court with a rare sense of continuity and calm. Catherine Parr's queenship demonstrates the power of wisdom, tact, and measured influence. She survived where others had perished, using intellect and diplomacy to navigate Henry's volatile temperament. In the final years of the king's life, she embodied the role of caretaker queen, a stabilizing force who balanced duty, compassion, and survival, leaving a lasting imprint on the Tudor legacy.
In the later years of Henry VIII's reign, religion had become a dangerous and divisive force at court. The king's break with Rome and the establishment of the Church of England had transformed England into a land of shifting alliances, doctrinal uncertainty, and political peril. For Catherine Parr, the queen consort, navigating these religious waters required intelligence, courage, and extraordinary discretion. Her personal beliefs leaned toward reformist Protestant ideas, a position that, if mishandled, could provoke the king's wrath and jeopardize her life. Catherine's role demanded delicate diplomacy. She hosted discussions on scripture and theology, carefully encouraging Henry to consider reformist perspectives without challenging his authority. The king, intrigued by her intellect, allowed some latitude in religious debate, yet any misstep could quickly become a matter of treason. At court, factions formed around religious loyalties. Conservative Catholics feared reform, while Protestant sympathizers sought to advance their positions. Each faction watched Catherine closely, assessing whether her influence over the king threatened their interests. The dangers were real and constant. Catherine's previous marriages and status as a widow already placed her in a delicate position. Her promotion of reformist ideas risked the perception of disloyalty or heresy. Letters, conversations, and even private advice were scrutinized by courtiers eager to report anything deemed seditious. One wrong word or misinterpreted gesture could have resulted in accusations similar to those that had led to the executions of Anne Boleyn and Catherine Howard. Yet Catherine Parr navigated this peril with remarkable skill. She used her intellect and tact to promote reform cautiously, earning the king's respect while safeguarding her own survival. Religion, in her hands, became both a tool and a test, a means to influence Henry and secure England's future, but also a constant reminder that in Tudor England, belief and survival were inseparably entwined. By 1546, Catherine Parr faced one of the most perilous moments of her queenship. Her reformist leanings, though subtle and carefully managed, had attracted suspicion from conservative factions at court. Henry VIII, aging, irritable, and increasingly prone to fits of paranoia, was not a king to tolerate perceived disloyalty or heresy. Courtiers watched nervously as whispers circulated, and the shadow of treason loomed, threatening to turn the queen's intellect and piety into deadly liabilities. Catherine's situation was precarious. Conservative nobles, eager to regain influence, exploited the king's temperament by circulating rumors of her Protestant sympathies and her engagement with reformist clergy. Letters and conversations, once innocuous, were now twisted into evidence of betrayal. The young queen had already navigated decades of courtly intrigue, but now even a misstep in her speech or correspondence could have proven fatal. The specter of her predecessors, Anne Boleyn and Catherine Howard, hung over her, reminding all that the line between favor and execution in Henry's court was razor thin. Yet Catherine's intelligence and diplomacy proved her salvation. She carefully defended herself when questioned, presenting her religious discussions as guidance for the king rather than sedition. Her calm demeanor and measured responses, combined with her reputation for loyalty, reassured Henry and diffused the crisis. Courtiers who had sought to entrap her found themselves powerless against her tact and foresight. Catherine Parr's narrow escape reinforced her reputation as a survivor, a queen who understood the deadly stakes of Tudor politics. Where others had fallen to rumors, misjudgment, or royal temper, Catherine's skill, prudence,
and subtle influence allowed her to maintain her position. The experience underscored a critical truth of life at Henry VIII's court. Survival depended on intellect, discretion, and the ability to navigate danger without attracting the king's deadly suspicion. By early 1547, Henry VIII's health had deteriorated significantly. Once a powerful and commanding monarch, he was now a shadow of his former self, burdened by obesity, chronic illness, and the cumulative effects of decades of indulgence and excess. The king's mobility was limited, and daily life was marked by pain, irritability, and constant fatigue. Yet even in his decline, Henry's presence dominated England. The machinery of government revolved around him, and his decisions remained absolute. Catherine Parr, ever the careful and devoted queen, attended to Henry with diligence, managing both his household and the delicate balance of court politics. She oversaw the king's medical care, mediated disputes among courtiers, and maintained a calm, stabilizing presence during a period when tension and anxiety ran high. Her tact and intelligence were invaluable as Henry's behavior became increasingly erratic, swinging between moments of lucidity, reflective melancholy, and bursts of rage. The king's final days were also a time of reflection and anxiety about succession. Edward, his young son by Jane Seymour, was the heir, but the future of the Tudor dynasty remained fragile. Henry's thoughts and decrees, though constrained by illness, continued to shape the kingdom, including religious policies, political alliances, and instructions regarding his family. Courtiers, knowing that the king's death was imminent, maneuvered cautiously, aware that favor and position could change overnight. Henry VIII died on January 28, 1447, leaving behind a kingdom forever transformed by his reign. His passing marked the end of an era characterized by ambition, desire, and the ruthless exercise of power. Catherine Parr, who had survived where so many of Henry's wives had perished, witnessed the conclusion of a reign that had defined both England and her own life. In the king's final days, the intertwined legacies of love, fear, and authority came into sharp focus, leaving a nation poised for transition under Edward VI and the next chapter of Tudor history.
January 28, 1547, marked the end of one of England's most tumultuous and transformative reigns. Henry VIII, a king whose life had been defined by ambition, desire, and absolute authority, breathed his last, leaving a nation both fearful and liberated. For decades, Henry had dominated England with a mix of charisma, cunning, and ruthlessness. His 6 marriages, wars, religious upheavals, and executions had left indelible marks on the country, shaping the monarchy and the course of history. The final days of Henry VIII were shadowed by illness, pain, and the weight of his own legacy. Obesity, chronic wounds, and infections had reduced the once powerful king to a figure of suffering, often bedridden and dependent on attendants. Courtiers moved cautiously around him, their actions guided as much by fear as by respect. Every word and gesture could be interpreted as loyalty or betrayal, a reminder of the dangerous courtly politics that had claimed the lives of Anne Boleyn and Catherine Howard. Henry's death was not just a personal end, but a symbolic moment. The tyrant who had reshaped the church, redefined royal authority, and instilled fear across his realm was gone. His passing left a power vacuum, a nation still divided by religion, faction, and the memory of his wrath. The young Edward VI, only 9 years old, ascended the throne,
signaling the start of a new era that would be shaped by advisors and regents while the memory of Henry's iron rule lingered. For the survivors, Catherine Parr, the remaining children, and the courtiers, the king's death was both a relief and a challenge. England mourned a tyrant whose ambition had forged a nation, yet imposed fear and suffering. The death of Henry VIII closed a dramatic chapter in Tudor history, a reign defined by love, betrayal, power, and the relentless pursuit of legacy, leaving behind a kingdom forever altered by his ambition and cruelty.
The death of Henry VIII in 1547 ushered in a new era under the reign of his only legitimate son, Edward VI, a boy of just 9 years old. England now faced the unprecedented challenge of being ruled by a child, dependent entirely on regents and advisors to maintain the fragile stability left by his father. The young king inherited not only the crown, but the complex legacy of a father whose reign had been marked by ambition, cruelty, and religious upheaval. Edward's accession immediately shifted the balance of power at court. Experienced nobles and trusted advisors assumed the role of regents, effectively governing the country while the boy king occupied the throne in name. Edward's mother, Jane Seymour, had died in childbirth, leaving the young Edward without maternal guidance, but his stepmother, Catherine Parr, continued to provide education, mentorship, and moral support. She taught him religion, literacy, and statecraft, preparing him to rule in a world shaped by the turbulence of his father's policies. The child king's court was a constant tension. Nobles maneuvered for influence, aware that controlling the young monarch meant shaping England's policies and future. Religious factions vied for power, seeking to advance reformist or conservative agendas. Every decision, from appointments to proclamations, reflected the competing interests surrounding Edward, who was too young to understand the full scope of authority, yet keenly aware of his responsibilities. Edward VI's reign began under the shadow of his father's immense legacy. The young king's upbringing, guided by capable tutors and regents, emphasized Protestant reform and governance, setting England on a course markedly different from the personal rule of Henry VIII. Yet his youth and inexperience made him vulnerable, and the kingdom's fate rested on those who surrounded him. The child king symbolized both hope and fragility, a delicate instrument through which England's future would be shaped, for better or worse, in the aftermath of Henry VIII's formidable and tumultuous reign. While Edward VI ascended the throne as England's child king, the legacy of Henry VIII's daughters, Mary and Elizabeth, loomed large over the Tudor realm. Both had survived the turbulence of their fathers' marriages, the religious upheavals, and the deadly politics of the court, and each embodied different aspects of his complex legacy. Their paths were shaped by survival, resilience, and the enduring influence of a father whose desire for a male heir had defined much of their childhood. Mary, Henry's eldest daughter by Catherine of Aragon, carried the weight of legitimacy and religious conviction. A staunch Catholic in a rapidly Protestantizing court, she navigated a world that had once sought to erase her from succession. Her upbringing had been marked by exile from the royal household and the constant tension of court politics, yet she emerged steadfast, deeply pious, and determined to reclaim her place in the line of succession when the opportunity arose. Elizabeth, daughter of Anne Boleyn, represented a different side of the Tudor inheritance. Intelligent, curious, and politically astute, she had learned from the downfall of her mother, Anne, the deadly consequences of ambition and courtly intrigue. Despite being declared illegitimate at one point, Elizabeth survived by cultivating alliances, mastering diplomacy,
and displaying a careful balance of obedience and independence that would later define her reign. Together, Mary and Elizabeth were living symbols of Henry VIII's complicated legacy, two daughters who had endured the dangers of court, the shifting tides of religion, and the demands of dynastic survival. While Edward would rule as a boy king, the futures of Mary and Elizabeth foreshadowed the eventual resurgence of female authority in England. Their lives demonstrated resilience, intelligence, and the subtle power of survival in a court defined by desire, ambition, and the deadly consequences of falling out of favor with the Tudor monarch.
Mary Tudor's rise to power was a dramatic and controversial chapter in Tudor history. After years of being declared illegitimate and sidelined at court, she finally ascended the throne in 1553 following the death of her half-brother, Edward VI. Mary inherited a kingdom fraught with religious tension, political uncertainty, and the lingering effects of her father's tumultuous reign. As the first queen regnant of England, her rule carried immense symbolic and practical significance, yet it would soon earn her the infamous nickname Bloody Mary. Mary's reign was defined by her unwavering commitment to restoring Roman Catholicism in England. A devout Catholic, she viewed the Protestant reforms enacted under her father and Edward VI as a moral and spiritual crisis. Determined to reverse the religious changes, she implemented policies that reinstated papal authority and reintroduced Catholic practices across the nation. Her fervent devotion, however, came at a cost. Those who resisted or openly defied her policies faced severe punishment, including execution. The burning of Protestant leaders and reformers at the stake became one of the most notorious aspects of Mary's reign. Figures such as Archbishop Thomas Cranmer and numerous ministers were publicly executed, a stark demonstration of the Queen's determination to enforce religious conformity. These acts of persecution earned her the epithet Bloody Mary, cementing her reputation as a ruler willing to wield fear and violence to achieve her objectives. Yet Mary's story is also one of personal struggle and political challenge. She ruled in the shadow of her father's legacy, contending with the memory of Henry VIII's tyranny and the precariousness of female authority in a male-dominated society. Her reign, though brief, highlighted the dangerous intersection of faith, power, and politics in Tudor England. Bloody Mary remains a figure both reviled and understood, a queen whose determination to uphold her beliefs forever shaped the course of English history. Following the tumultuous reign of Mary I, Elizabeth Tudor ascended the throne in 1558, stepping into a kingdom scarred by religious persecution, political instability, and the shadows of her father's formidable legacy. The daughter of Anne Boleyn, Elizabeth had survived the deadly intrigues of Henry VIII's court, her mother's execution, and years of careful political navigation. Now, as queen, she faced the monumental task of uniting a divided nation and securing her place as a female ruler in a male-dominated world. Elizabeth's early reign was defined by prudence, intelligence, and a keen understanding of political strategy. She inherited a fragile kingdom, deeply polarized between Catholics and Protestants. Unlike her half-sister Mary, Elizabeth approached religion with pragmatism and moderation, seeking a settlement that would stabilize England while avoiding the extremes that had fueled civil unrest. Her policies carefully balanced competing factions, allowing her to consolidate power without provoking rebellion. Elizabeth's personal experience with danger and betrayal shaped her approach to governance. She cultivated loyalty among her courtiers while remaining cautious of potential rivals, understanding that her survival depended on both diplomacy and vigilance. Charismatic and intellectually gifted, she used her presence, speeches, and patronage to inspire confidence in her rule.
Her careful control of public image, combined with her political acumen, transformed her from a once uncertain princess into a symbol of stability and strength. Under Elizabeth, England entered a period of cultural flourishing, maritime expansion, and political consolidation. Her rise marked the triumph of resilience over adversity, demonstrating that intelligence, patience, and adaptability could overcome the dangers that had claimed so many before her. Elizabeth Tudor became the embodiment of survival, wisdom, and authority, solidifying her legacy as one of England's greatest monarchs and reshaping the future of the nation her father had once ruled with fear and ambition. The story of Henry VIII's 6 wives is one of love, ambition, betrayal, and survival, a saga that has echoed through the centuries. Though their lives were shaped by the king's desires and the deadly politics of the Tudor court, each wife left an indelible mark on England's history, demonstrating courage, resilience, and the human costs of power. Catherine of Aragon, Henry's first wife, embodied steadfast loyalty and moral conviction. Her refusal to accept annulment in defense of her marriage and faith set the stage for England's break with Rome, a seismic shift that reshaped religion and politics. Anne Boleyn, ambitious, intelligent, and politically astute, challenged tradition and became a catalyst for reform. Yet her boldness ultimately led to her execution, a warning of the dangers of power and defiance in Henry's court. Jane Seymour, the gentle and devoted queen, fulfilled the king's greatest desire by giving birth to Edward VI, cementing the Tudor dynasty, but she paid the ultimate price with her life. Anne of Cleves survived political misjudgment through tact and diplomacy, becoming a rare example of a queen who escaped Henry's lethal judgment. Catherine Howard's youth and indiscretions led to her tragic downfall, illustrating the deadly combination of naivety and ambition under an unforgiving monarch. Finally, Catherine Parr, the intelligent and prudent queen, survived the king's final years, serving as a mentor and stabilizing force for Henry's children and leaving a lasting legacy of wisdom and survival. Together, these 6 women reflect the complex interplay of power, love, and danger in Tudor England. Their stories remind us that behind the grandeur of the monarchy lay personal sacrifice, political intrigue, and human vulnerability. Each wife, whether executed, divorced, or widowed, shaped the course of English history, and their lives continue to fascinate, instruct, and inspire. In remembering Henry VIII's wives, we confront both the ambition of kings and the resilience of the women who endured, and in their memory, the human dimension of power is never forgotten.
In the court of Henry VIII, love was never merely an emotion. It was a weapon, a tool for ambition, manipulation, and survival. For the king and his 6 wives, passion and politics were inseparable, each relationship defined as much by desire as by power, dynasty, and strategy. Love could elevate a woman to the throne or destroy her within weeks. It could grant influence, wealth, and security, or strip away life and legacy in an instant. Anne Boleyn's rise exemplified the dangerous duality of love and ambition. Her charm, wit, and beauty captivated Henry, turning affection into political leverage. Through the king's desire, Anne gained unprecedented influence, shaping policy, advancing reform, and challenging traditional norms of courtly power. Yet that same love became a weapon against her, as rivals used her influence to provoke jealousy, suspicion, and accusations that ultimately led to her execution. In Henry's court, love and lust were inseparable from fear, strategy, and survival. Catherine Howard, too, became a victim of love's perilous power. Her youthful indiscretions, romantic dalliances, and flirtatious charm enthralled the king,
but ultimately fueled her downfall. Inexperience made her vulnerable to the manipulations of courtiers, whose reports of her past behavior transformed affection into a tool for political condemnation. Even Jane Seymour's devotion was intertwined with dynastic necessity. Her loyalty and perceived love for Henry secured her influence at court and produced the long-sought male heir. Yet she paid the ultimate price with her life, showing that love, even genuine, could carry deadly consequences. In the Tudor court, love was never private. It was weaponized, politicized, and scrutinized, shaping the fates of queens and kings alike. Each marriage, each romance, and each betrayal became part of a dangerous game where affection could protect or destroy, and the heart, far from being innocent, was as powerful and perilous as the sword. The story of Henry VIII and his 6 wives remains one of the most compelling chapters in English history. From Catherine of Aragon's steadfast loyalty to Anne Boleyn's ambition, Jane Seymour's devotion, Anne of Cleves' survival, Catherine Howard's youthful tragedy, and Catherine Parr's wisdom, each woman shaped the course of the Tudor dynasty. Their lives reveal the intricate dance of love, power, and danger in a court ruled by one of England's most formidable monarchs. Beyond personal drama, the marriages of Henry VIII left enduring consequences for religion, politics, and succession. Catherine of Aragon's fight for her marriage ignited England's break with the Catholic Church. Anne Boleyn's influence propelled the Protestant Reformation forward. Jane Seymour gave birth to Edward VI, securing the Tudor line. Anne of Cleves demonstrated the value of diplomacy and restraint, while Catherine Howard's tragic end exposed the deadly risks of courtly ambition. Finally, Catherine Parr's intelligence and tact ensured her survival and allowed her to guide the next generation, including Elizabeth I, who would become one of England's greatest monarchs. The lives of these 6 women remind us that behind the grandeur of monarchy lay human vulnerability, courage, and resilience. They endured love, betrayal, and the relentless pressures of a king whose desires could dictate life or death. Their stories continue to captivate historians, writers, and audiences worldwide, illustrating timeless lessons about power, survival, and the human cost of ambition. If you've enjoyed this journey through the Tudor court, don't forget to subscribe, like, and share. By supporting the channel, you help bring more historical stories to life, exploring the drama, intrigue, and legacy of the people who shaped our world. The saga of Henry VIII and his 6 wives may be centuries old, but its lessons and fascination remain as vivid and compelling today as they were in the corridors of the Tudor palace.